Welcome to the writer's review of The Lies of Lock Lamora by Scott Lynch. As with all my reviews, the first part of this video will be spoiler-free, and then at the end I'll finish up with a writing lesson section intended for the writers among you, and before I get into that, I will have a spoiler warning. The Lies of Lock Lamora is the first book in the Gentleman Bastard series, with 2 more sequels already out in print. A 4th is also already announced, and hopefully on its way. Technically, the book falls in the fantasy category, but I'd personally describe it more as a fictional historic drama set in a world with a smattering of fantastical elements, and at heart the novel is a thieving adventure story with an emphasis on schemes of confidence. It features several point-of-view characters, most of which are a part of the thieving group named the Gentleman Bastards, and as the title implies, the most prominent of these is Lock Lamora, who serves as the book's main protagonist. In terms of structure, the novel is built out of 2 major parts. The first and largest is the main body, which chronologically follows Lock's point of view through the events of the plot, and is basically the novel-y part of the book. And the second, which is made up out of a dozen or so short stories interspersed between the various chapters, and cover various past and present events and characters. As for the story itself, it is set in a sort of 17th century fantastical marine city, kind of akin to Venice. It starts out right as the protagonist joins the criminal underworld as a child, then follows a bit of his youth, and then jumps straight into his adult life and the heist he's currently undertaking with his gang. This heist then continues to play a major role in the novel's plot right until the end, although plenty more complications and other intrigue pops up before the story comes to a complete close. The 2 main storytelling elements you can expect to see a lot of throughout this novel are drama and comedy. The drama is by far the most prevalent aspect to this novel, since almost the whole plot is driven by dialogue between the various characters. It's also the most enjoyable part of this novel, since the author does an excellent job writing complex yet still believable dialogue. The comedy, on the other hand, is also quite prominent throughout the book in various shapes and forms, but by no means do I mean that the novel is a comedy at heart. I'd say that roughly 50% of the laughs are driven out with character and situation-driven humor, while the rest are brought out with the enjoyment that comes along with watching the protagonists outsmart their marks and adversaries. In terms of other storytelling elements you can expect to find from this novel, there's world building, which mostly deals with the various cultures and religions throughout this fictional world, in large part due to the confidence scheme aspect to this story. It also touches on the remnants of a long-lost advanced civilization, but that's just fluff for the most part, although this might become more important in the coming books, but I can't say for certain since I haven't gotten that far yet. Surprisingly, there's very little action depicted throughout this novel, with perhaps less than a dozen short fight scenes featured in it, and only 2 or 3 of these having any real bearing on the plot. There's also a lot of suspense throughout this novel. Of course, I don't mean the horror kind, but a kind which originates from the double-crossing and intrigue between the individual characters, which leaves you worried whether the main character actually has the upper hand over his foes. And in terms of fantasy, it plays mostly a decorative role in the first half of the novel, and only becomes a slight bit more prevalent in the latter half with the introduction of a new character. This book also has a couple quirks I think you should be aware of, the first of which is its use of very colorful language. If you as a person typically shy away from cursing or foul language, or are just looking to pick up this novel as a gift for a young relative or friend, then this book definitely isn't for you. Imagine how stereotypical baddies like bandits or pirates are typically depicted in movies or series, and their typical word choices. Well, that's basically how every character in this book speaks. The second quirk is this novel's large emphasis on accents, which comes from the confidence scheme aspect of the plot. This, in my opinion, gives the audiobook a lot more depth than usual, So if you haven't tried audiobooks yet, here's your chance to experience what a very good audiobook can do. Now, before I get into spoilers, I personally really enjoyed The Lies of Lock Lamora. I actually first picked up this novel because I liked the cover art of the third book in this series, and was actually really surprised by how good this book's plot was. And of course, as I've already mentioned, the narrator also does an amazing job voicing over the audiobook. Now, if you don't believe my opinion, I'll put up some general ratings from the sites I usually do, and as you can see, in general, people find this novel just as enjoyable as I did. This book is available in ebook, paperback, hardcover, and audiobook formats. It comes in at just under 200,000 words, or 22 hours in length for the audiobook version, and that's roughly twice the length of your typical novel, or maybe even a slight bit more. The Kindle version is the cheapest option out of the group as usual, followed by the paperback and hardcover copies. For the audiobook listeners out there, there is a WhisperSync deal available, and that totals at $16, so you might as well use your Audible credit, especially if you don't need the ebook. These prices might have changed by the time you're watching this video, so I'll have Amazon links listed down in the description below. Now I'll be going into the lesson section of this video, so spoiler warning ahead. Now, I've already mentioned this author's use of language, and it's something you can passively absorb throughout the entire length of the novel, most notable of which is the constant presence of cursing within dialogues. Personally, I hardly ever use profanity in my writing, because I found it cringy anytime I tried. So it was a very interesting experience seeing how foul language could be seamlessly incorporated into a story, and I think I grew a bit more comfortable with the idea of incorporating some of it into my own novel. Of course, there's a lot more to this book than just simple profanity. The rest of the narration is also very colorful and rich in terms of style and storytelling, and I'm sure that over the coming years I'm gonna reread this book a couple more times just to absorb as much of the vocabulary as I can, and I think you could learn a lot as well if you did the same. Another thing to take note of is the author's expert writing of dialogue, since he incorporates actual rhetoric and negotiation techniques. The most notable example of this is at the very beginning of the book, when Locke and the gang initiate their con with Don Salvara in chapter 4. If you remember, the main characters convince their Mark to take part in their scam of his own accord, meaning that they don't force Don Salvara into their business interaction, but instead they present their business in a way where the Don wants to take part in it himself to undermine his political and business rival. All of these are real negotiation, or in this case manipulation tactics, which basically removes the need for the reader to suspend his disbelief, since the characters aren't going along with the scheme simply to get the plot moving. And I think that the same can be said about many more conversations Locke has with the Don, Spider, and the Grey King. And lastly, there's the author's clever use of interludes. I'm usually not a fan of these, since I often find them as a means to get more length out of a novel without adding any real content to the core of the story. But with this novel, I found them quite enjoyable because of two reasons. Firstly, there's not too many of these, so they don't pop up before and after every single chapter, but are instead spread out enough not to be annoying. And second, their content usually ties in with the main storyline. In my opinion, most serve a character development role, since most of the characters and their relationships are defined by their histories, and instead of simply telling the reader about these events, the author makes use of these short stories to actually show them and make them that much more impactful. For instance, imagine how less meaningful the relationship between Locke and Jean would be if the conflict between the young gentleman bastards and the half-crowns was depicted in a single paragraph instead of a detailed interlude, and I think that the same could be said for the mathematics short story, where Jean and Locke get first introduced to each other. Well, that wraps up my review on The Lies of Lock Lamora by Scott Lynch. I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, consider leaving a like and subscribing for more reviews in the future. It really does help a lot. I look forward to seeing you on the next writer's review.